Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to the second part in this lion tutorial series as well. A little while ago I posted the first part to this, so if you haven't checked that out before watching this, then make sure you go and check out the first part first. It's a whole, I think, roughly 2-hour tutorial in real time. It's one of the ones that I offer over on my Patreon page, so if you want to follow along and draw a realistic lion, then go and check out that first and then come back and watch this, because this follows on from that, and I'll leave a link in the description below for you guys. But without further ado, let's get into this second part of this tutorial. Okay, so we're going to start on the mane. So to start this off, we're just going to layer down some of the lighter colours, because you've got all of these sort of like really light yellows on this side by the eye. And we're going to gradually get darker as we start to sort of head towards the top of the head, and obviously as you're coming in around the chin and all of those places. So what we're going to do first is just layer down some cream or ivory. I'm also just going to lift the graphite ever so slightly, so I'm just going to roll my kneaded eraser over this. So we're going to start somewhere sort of halfway in the middle and at the top here. So just getting rid of all of that graphite there. So I've just got my little colour swatch to lean on. And all we're going to do is start on this section here. And we're just going to follow the direction in which the fur flows. So on the line art, I have sort of marked out some of these. There's a few lines like here which denote the sort of direction that you need to go. So you just need to follow those lines, just follow the sort of curvature that they're making. Look at the tips of the fur, so the very ends here, just look at what direction they're pointing down, and also look at where the fur sort of attaches itself to the face, and then you want to connect the two by doing a fluid motion. Now this fur on the mane is quite long, but we're not going to be adding in a lot of fur strokes for this. A majority of this is going to be shaded because it's that really soft sort of fluffy texture. So we're just adding down a shaded base layer. You just want to use a light pressure to begin with. Don't use too much of a harder pressure. You just want to map everything in. You just want to get this base down. We're just mapping in some big chunks. Let's come into about here, and then we're just going to come up to the top part now. So this is where this top section sort of comes down in a slightly different direction, so we just need to look at the clump that this is making here. So we've got a small clump here just coming in a slightly different direction, and then we've got another clump just above it which again comes in a slightly different direction. So you're just going to look at each individual section and just sort of work out the direction in which they're all going in. So it's much easier to look at different clumps, so you want to see where one section of hair intersects another and work that way. So we're just going to work up to here for now. So again, just shading lightly. I know it's hard to see this base layer as I'm putting it down. Okay, so then what we're going to do is start to work on the lighter tones and sort of bringing the facial fur out into the mane a little bit. To do that, we're going to be using a little bit of nougat, some raw umber, and some of the dark Naples ochre as well. So we're going to start off with the raw umber. We're just going to take a really light hand, and we're just going to really lightly add this down directly next to the face and just gently start to bring it into the mane. So just really, really gently, a really light pressure. And again, just following the direction, working clump by clump. And just bringing the yellow out into the mane. So still shading. Just want to keep your pressure on your pencil really nice and loose. Then we're just going to switch to some of the nougat, and we're going to just start to bring in some of these little fur lines which come from the face and into the mane here, especially at the top. They're just going to also help to make it a little bit darker, which is perfect for this little section at the top here. So I'm also going to add in some shading just to help to really quickly darken some of this area here. But we're just adding in really tiny little fur strokes, just coming off the face, blending it into the rest of the fur here. Like so, and we're going to also take a little bit of the terracotta, and we're just going to introduce a little tiny bit of that to the top section just to add a little bit more of an orange note. And again, just really gently sort of glazing and shading this over the top. So really gentle hand. And we're going to take some of the walnut brown, and we're just going to darken underneath this clump up here. So we're just going to start to add in some of the shadows. So you can use a little bit more pressure on your pencil at this point and start to add in the shadows. But remember to lift the pressure off your pencil as you come back into the lighter sections of the fur. So you want to create a really nice gentle gradation of sort of shadow colour. You just don't want to leave it kind of stark because it kind of looks a little bit unnatural, so you just want to blend it in a little bit. You can use some fur lines to blend that in as well. Okay, so we're just gonna just exaggerate a few of these little markings here as well. Just slide here and just blend them out ever so slightly with the walnut brown. I'm also going to use some of the dark sepia and just get a little bit heavier on this shadow up here. Also going to use some of the burnt sienna just to add a little bit of a warm kick to this little shadow down here. So we also need to just bring through some of that nougat and strengthen some of the raw umber, especially as we sort of come towards where you've got a little bit of a concave in the fur just here. So we're going to take the raw umber first of all and just start to shade down once more. Again, you're just going to use a light pressure, really light shading. You want to bring this into the slightly lighter section here as well. And then as we come down sort of through the middle of this, where it is sort of, it's coming sort of out from the face, bowing in and then coming back out. And where you've got that dip in the fur, that's where it's a little bit darker. And that's where we just need to concentrate a little bit more of this raw umber. And again, you want to make sure that you follow the fur direction. So when something dips in the middle like this, you kind of get sort of a U shape, but it's kind of like a really soft curved L. And that's the kind of motion and the shading direction and sort of shape that you want to make in that fur there. So you can go over a couple times, start to add in some fur lines if you find it easier. Just get that bit in there a little bit darker. You can add in some burnt sienna and some terracotta as well. I'm going to go in with the terracotta next. Get that nice orange glow. So we're trying to match the same kind of tone as what we've got going on the face here. So that's kind of what you're aiming for. And get a little bit darker with some of the burnt sienna. Again, just lightly shading. You can start to add in some fur lines if you are at that point where you need to add a little bit of definition in the fur. So a majority of this mane will be made up with shading, but you do need to go in with your darker colours just to add a little bit of texture. I'm going to use the walnut brown, but I'm going to give mine a sharpen so I've got a nice sharp point, and we're going to add in some darker lines through here. We're also going to add in a tiny little bit of green shading as well. We're going to use the walnut brown first. We're just going to lightly bring in some fur lines. You're going to bring it all the way through this lighter section, all the way to the face. And then we're going to use some of the chromium green opaque. And we're just going to lightly glaze this down into some of the shadows, blend it through parts of the fur here as well. So you want to use your pencil quite far on the side so you limit the amount of pressure that you're actually putting through the pencil, and add some shadow down. So we need to just go through and add a little bit of light tone to the tips of this mane. So I'm just going to use the yellow, and again just use like a glazing motion, just really gently on the side, just to add a tiny little bit of hint of colour down there. And then I'm just going to go in with the raw umber, and towards the tips of the fur there tends to be several kind of different directions that this goes in, so I'm just kind of going in a few different directions, overlapping it, just making it look kind of really nice and fluffy. And again we can go in and strengthen some of the shadows, so you can take your terracotta, strengthen some of the orange tones. You can use a slightly darker orange as well. We can go in with some of the, sorry about that, go in with some Indian red. Just make some really nice rich red tones in this section here. Then we can use some of the dark chrome yellow as well, just to give it a little bit of sort of not iridescent, but a sort of highlighted nature there. And we can just add in a bit more texture and bring some more walnut brown through, all the way to the face again. Just keep your fur lines quite far apart when you do that, so that you don't end up filling all of the light space with the darker colour. You want to keep that lighter space obviously quite light, so just spreading your fur lines further apart will help to maintain that sort of light undertone that you've built there. Okay, so now we can just go on to this part here. So this is a whole lot darker up there. We're going to go in with the same method. We're going to use the raw umber really lightly, just to sort of sketch in all of the different clumps and the directions, and then we'll start to build in the shadows and then fill in the midtones. So again, light pressure on the raw umber. It's coming into all of the different clumps, just working clump by clump. So you've got a small one just here which sort of almost overlaps this section that we've just drawn, sort of comes down, and then it sort of swiftly moves up and just starts to come up like a big bouffant on his head here. So we're just going to swing the direction around and start to work in some of these bits here. So at the ends of the mane, I'm just really kind of flicking the pencil out, almost like a fur line, but still kind of keeping it shaded. So just working clump by clump. Every time the fur sort of changes direction, that's when I'm sort of denoting that that's a new clump that's formed there, and just keeping the shading really nice and light. You'll notice as well that with this section I didn't go in and blend at all, and that's because you want to kind of keep it kind of like, I like the texture of the paper showing through when I do this kind of texture. It just adds a whole nother element. It gives it a little bit more structure, whereas when it's blended and really nice and smooth, it tends to look a little bit unrealistic. So I don't like to do any kind of blending, but if you feel like you want to do blending, perhaps that's like a stylistic choice, you like it when your style is nice and blended and smooth, then feel free to go ahead and add some blending with a solvent or a white pencil or something. But for me personally, I like it when it's quite rough looking on this kind of texture. So we're just filling in all of the raw umber, like so. And then what we're going to do is come in again with the raw umber and start to add in some of the darker areas. So following this dark line up here, I'm going to start to add in all of this. This gets a little bit darker right next to the head here. And then just going into where clumps meet one another is generally where you have a little bit of a darker shadow. So I'm just going in with a bit of a heavier pressure where those two clumps meet or part, and then I'm just lifting the pressure as we work back into the lighter areas just to blend it through. You can start to see some darker areas and all the clumps kind of forming. And we're just going to move on and get darker. So for these darker sections, I'm going to go in with some of the burnt sienna. So going over with that. So again, just shading into these darker areas, and as we work into the lighter sections, just gently lifting the pressure. And then we're going to take some of the walnut brown and just get darker on these bits here. So again, increasing the pressure just to really get that nice and dark. Adding in a few fur lines just to blend this out a little. We're also going to be adding in some of the Caput Mortuum Violet into this. Just shading this over where we've just added the walnut brown, just to give it a really nice shadow effect. Then coming in with some of the dark sepia, again just to add in some really kind of dark areas. Just adding in some fur lines and really flicking them out towards the lighter areas to help to blend this together. I'm just going to take some burnt sienna and just blend that through once more. And we're going to start to work on the midtones. So we're going to take some of the yellow and just blend and shade this over, working clump by clump, going in the direction. So the more we start to add the midtones, the more we'll start to blend all of these darker areas together. So when it's like this, it kind of looks a little bit odd, but as soon as we start to add in all of these midtones, it sort of brings all of the elements together. So just really starting to shade down some of the yellow. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is just take some of the terracotta and just start to fill in some of these darker areas. So we want a nice orange section. And we're going to darken those shadows once more with some burnt sienna and all of that, but we're just going over with some of the terracotta just to get a really kind of nice orange gingery tone down, which is really present as we come up through the top of the head here. We're going to take some of the walnut brown at the same time as doing this, and we're going to just bring some fur lines into some of these shadow areas. Bring a little bit of texture. So we're just working clump by clump as we have been. Just adding a little bit of this shadow down. Also going to be using some of the burnt sienna and bringing that through all of the lighter orange and yellow tones as well. So just bringing some fur lines through of some burnt sienna and then just darkening with some of the walnut brown. So adding in some more shadow. Just continuing to use the walnut brown to just add in some fur lines and then switching between that and the burnt sienna every now and then. Shading down some more walnut brown when we have some really dark areas, and just starting to vary up the sort of sway of the fur lines. So instead of keeping them all kind of going in the same direction, when you start to come towards a finishing point with the shadows and adding in some texture, just start to really kind of bend the fur strokes so that they're sort of sitting over and overlapping one another, so you get a kind of more sort of really kind of fluffy texture. So we're just going to take the nougat and we're just going to shade some of the ends here, just bringing in some shading, just because this side of the face and the mane is in a little bit more shadow, so it's just slightly darker. We're also just going to take some more yellow, really layer this down in here, make it really kind of nice and vibrant. Adding in some of this dark chrome yellow as well. I'm going to use some of the Caput Mortem Violet just to work into some of these darker bits. And then finally going in with some more of the Walnut Brown and just darkening certain sections just by going in with some shading. And using some of the dark sepia as well at this point. Okay, I'm also just going to use some of the burnt ochre. Come in here with that. A little bit of a Indian red as well, especially down at the face where everything is just a tiny little bit darker, like so. We just need to blend out some of these shadow tones just by softening the edges, really blending it through to the lighter sections of the fur. And what we can do if you need to add any kind of strands over the top, some lighter sections or anything like that, you can take a scalpel. I've just got my slice tool. What I'm going to do is just move in the direction of the fur, especially where there are lighter sections sort of sitting over these darker bits, and just using the blade to just lift some of the coloured pencil off. Really gently. Just create some lighter lines through here. Just create the illusion that you've got some lighter patches sitting over these darker patches. It just helps to blend them through a little bit more as well. Also just adds a little bit of texture and interest to the mane. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next section. So we're just going to come down the left hand side of the face so that we don't end up smudging any of the work as we move up and over. So we're going to come down to about here and just add in all of this part of the mane. Again, this bit's really easy because there's not really many of these kind of really kind of tonal change areas and bits of the fur that kind of dip in and out of one another. We don't have that too much of that going on, so it's fairly straightforward. So we're going to add down a base layer of the cream or the ivory, whatever one you're using. I'm going to just lift a little bit of the graphite with my kneaded eraser though. So all the way down here. And we can just add in our base layer, again remembering to work in the direction that the fur's going in. Most of it's just coming down the face now, especially as we get down to the bottom sections down here. So there is a slightly fluffier tuft just coming off the face as well, which we just need to add in. So add that in. And then all of the fur just like curls up a little bit. It sort of dips in, so we're just following that sort of lazy L shape. And then it comes down to the edges. And then past the nose, it's just pretty much all straight down, which is pretty straightforward. Okay, so same thing here, we're just going to work in some of the raw umber. We're not going to work into this lighter section on the face there though, we're going to work around that to begin with. We're just going to follow exactly the same process as before, just using a light pressure, just adding in the direction of the fur. This time though, where we do have some darker areas, we're just going to go straight in and do a couple layers of the raw umber straight away. We are going to shade all of this mane with the raw umber. So again, while we've got darker areas, we're just going to go in and layer down the raw umber. Just increase the pressure if you need to. Increase the number of layers. So just coming off the edges and just bringing some like fur strokes just to create that kind of messy edge. coming into the beard section, if you're just coming into that bit, you need to bring your raw umber into that section, so you're working sort of against the fur direction. Just to sort of separate that area, so you end up with some really nice fine white lines. Of course you can also use your scalpel or something to lift the colour of the sort of whiter beard fur towards the end. So I've got this lighter section right next to the face here, which is perfect. Just going to bring some raw umber and bring some fur strokes through that. Also just going to use the nougat just to start shading in some shadows. So coming into some of the darker sections and just increasing the pressure, just increasing that shadow. Just adding some of the nougat to all of the mane down the bottom here, just where it's in a lot more shadow, so it's going to be a little bit sort of darker anyway, so just adding all of that down. And then we're just going to bring in some fur lines from the face with the nougat into this lighter patch that we've just left out here. I'm going to use some of the sky blue just to add a little bit of blue tone down, just to highlight that that's like a little bit of a lighter area. Then we're just going to take the walnut brown and some of the raw umber and just start to get a little bit darker in these areas. So just shading. Adding down some really simple shading. Using the walnut brown just to go into some of the slightly darker areas and just really darken them up. So using that sort of backwards fur method to just bring some of these fur strokes into this sort of lighter area. Going to use some of the burnt ochre to start to bring down some of these orange tones. I'm going to use some of the burnt sienna as well, just to add in some fur lines and a little bit of detail into the fur here. So just using a combination of all of the colours here, I'm just going to start to shade down a little bit more of the raw umber, just to get a little bit of that more sort of orangey yellow tone. A little bit of the burnt ochre on the lighter patch on the face here, just to blend it through, and using some of that walnut brown just to blend that edge through, just using some fur strokes. I'm going to use some of the Caput Mortuum Violet just to add in some slightly darker shadows on this sort of concave or convex shape of the main fur there. I'm going to use some of the dark Naples ochre just to add a little bit of a yellower hue. And then going back to the raw umber, getting a lot darker. And then going in with some of the burnt sienna. Just adding in some texture, just using some longish fur lines, just coming from this darker area around the mouth. I'm actually just going to go into that area around the mouth with some of the walnut brown. I'm also going to add in some sky blue for a little bit of shading. Just a little bit more of sort of a natural shading tone. And just using the burnt sienna just to come through all of this mane and just start to add in a little bit of texture. I'm also going to use some terracotta for some orange tones, just where you've got that convex shape there. I'm using some of the nougat just to take the tone down a little bit, just using the pencil on the side, just working it all over, just adding in some shading coming off of the edges of the fur, and just also adding in a few little elements of detail with this as well, just to give the mane a rough edge. Going back in with the terracotta and just adding in some orange, and then coming in with the burnt sienna and just coming into some of the ends here, just where they sit underneath other areas, and just adding in some fur lines, bringing it back through to the lighter areas through here. Also just going to use some of the walnut brown back in this section here. Using a little bit more of the Caput Mortuum Violet, and finally going in with some more walnut brown, just really adding in the darker shadows and the darker textural elements now as well. I'm going to add a tiny little bit of green shading around this bit here. It's just going to help to create a sort of grayscale effect mixing with these oranges. Which is perfect, and again just adding a little bit of this through the shadows of the mane up here. Just helps to create a sort of bit more of a neutral balanced tone. Just helps to demudify the area as well by adding in too much brown. So you don't want to end up with too much brown and it looking too muddy. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just bring in the scalpel once more. I'm just going to overlap some of these whiter edges here. Just very subtly. And then just add in a little bit of fur overlapping. And what we're going to do is just tone up this area as well, just by going in with some of the warm grey 3. Just tone that down, adding in a little bit of the light flesh as well. This helps to tone that and bring it all together. So you can see our mane is really starting to come together now. So now that we've added in the left hand side, we need to come along and do the area on top. So we're just going to approach this in exactly the same way as what we have for all of this. We're just going to add in our base layers, start to get a little bit heavier where we have some shadows. This section through here is heavily shadowed. It follows sort of this direction. This bit here is really dark. Then we've got all of this golden colour around the right hand side, which we're going to be using a lot of the dark chrome yellow for, and then it fades into a darker tone around the back here. So the next part we're going to do is this top section, so we'll come around and just fill in all of this section of the mane. Okay, so let's put our base down. for this bit here. I'm just going to use the cream or the ivory, whatever one you have, and we're just going to fill in, just go in the direction of the mane. So we're just filling in, it's just sweeping off up to the upper left hand corner. So that's the direction in which we're going to shade, and we're just adding in light pressured shading to begin with. So we're just going to fill in as much as we can up the top here, so also just coming around this bit. Sweeping off towards the left. Just putting in a big patch of his lovely mane. Like so. Then what we're going to do is just work in some of that raw umber. So we just want to continue some of the raw umber, especially just coming from the left side here. Just want to work lightly, again working in the direction that the main fur is going. So we've got all of this dark area here as well. So this dark area, we're just going to go in a second with some of the walnut brown and just map that in straight away. So we're going to take some of the walnut brown and we're going to add in all of the dark areas. So you can see where it sort of comes from the top of the head here. And we're just going to just gently shade in, just using a light pressure. Just sort of shade in the shape and this big block of dark fur on the head here. So just filling all of this in. So you just got a dark section started off here, and we're just going to go into that bit with some of the Caput Mortuum Violet as well. So again, just gently layering over. And then in the surrounding areas, we're just going to build up some more of that raw umber. Blend it into this darker section a little bit as well. We're just lightly shading. We're just going to build up some of the tones. So we're going to take some of the burnt ochre and just build in some orange tones directly next to this darker area here. I'm also going to build in some burnt sienna. Taking the burnt sienna pencil and just building some of the fur lines and some sort of textural elements, really coming into this darker area, just increasing the pressure as well so we can get an even darker colour starting to build through this area here. Just going back to shading so we can get a lot more of the colour down quicker. Going to the walnut brown and just really increasing the pressure, really darkening this up. I'm going to take the raw umber and some of the dark Naples ochre. I'm just going to put some of that down first, just as a really light base layer on some of these fur sections just above here. So I'm just starting to fill in some of the different clumps. So just following where you've got specific areas of fur that's surrounded by shadow and looking at the direction, and then where there's any sort of direction changes, that's where we're going to add in the shadows. That's how you're going to define the clumps for this. So just using a combination of the raw umber and that dark Naples ochre. I'm going to get slightly darker with some burnt sienna. Just bring it through this darker section here, and I'm just starting to make some fur lines as well so we can get a nice edge to the mane, and also just bringing in that texture. And I'm working backwards into this yellow that I just added down as well, so that we get that sort of sparse look, so you've got some of the lighter fur overlapping the darker fur. That's what we're after there. Going to continue building some of the darker tones with the burnt sienna. And going in with some of the walnut brown and really darkening this time. So again, just going in with a bit of a heavier pressure, really sort of shading down where you have some sort of block, really dark areas. And then just coming in and adding some fern lines and dispersing it through the lighter sections. So just really adding down some of the walnut brown and some of this darker area above the head. Just remembering to work sort of in the direction that the fur is going in. And I'm just going to incorporate some of the Caput Mortuum Violet through there. And I'm also going to use some of the dark sepia get really nice and dark there, especially right at the base of the head. It sort of gets a little bit lighter as we tape it out towards the ends of the mane. So just continuing to add some fur stripes in. I'm also just going to use some of the burnt ochre, just shading that in, just to blend the orange tone into this darker tone here. And I'm also just going to use some walnut brown to bring some darker strokes through. So before we continue adding in all of the darker elements, we're just going to add in some of the lighter elements off to this side. So for that we're just going to do exactly the same, just layer down some of the raw umber. I'm going to start at the top because it's a lot easier to sort of manage at the top here. It's all going in the same direction. So when we do get further down here, there are a few different direction changes. I'm just going to start off just by coming into the top of the head and just looking at this piece by piece, like really small sections, so we don't get overwhelmed. Now if you need to, you can add a little piece down, so if you're mapping in a particular clump, you can map that in with your base of the raw umber, and then what you can do is go around it and define it straight away with some of the walnut brown. Just make sure you go really lightly, use a light shading motion, blend it into the raw umber. And then move on to the next clump and then do exactly the same. And then move on to the next clump and again do the same there. So you just work in small section by small section. And you can see all of the different areas sort of coming together. Move on to the next bit. So you slowly start to piece together all of the mane. And then eventually these clumps sort of disperse at the ends into the rest of the fur, the main fur. I'm going to just fill in the top parts now that we've defined some of those clumps there. Just start shading those in. Finish off defining some of these clumps and all that down the bottom. Okay, so that's all of that part that we've added the base layer to. So now we can just start to get darker. So I'm just going to add over a really light glaze of the dark Naples ochre over the areas that sort of are nearer to the face. So we've got a lot of that sort of highlighting of the fur there. I'm also going to add over a layer of the dark chrome yellow, which is like this really kind of vibrant, sort of almost luminous orange. So just shading this down over everything. And we've already defined our darker clumps, so those are going to stay in place. We just lightly shade over. They're still visible, as you can see. And then we're just going to take a little bit of the light cadmium red, shade some of this down, just really lightly sort of into the bottom of the clump areas. And just gradually bringing it up. And then what we're going to do is just start to build with some of the burnt ochre and the burnt sienna. So I'm going to give the burnt sienna a quick sharpen. Also going to build in some of the Caput Mortuum violet as well. So we're going to start just by bringing in a little bit more of this darker tone round. So I'm just using the Caput Mortuum violet at this stage. Just continuing to sort of darken and bring around this tone, and just blending it through, working backwards into the fur direction. So the fur's flowing this way and we're working backwards into it. So just adding in some more Caput Mortuum violet, just continuing with that. And we're just going to build in some of the burnt ochre, so we're just going to use a heavier pressure, especially where we do have the sort of more richer orange tones which are right next to the head. And this is also going to act as like a smoothing out. It's going to act as like a little bit of a blending tone. So we're just going to work from the darker areas using a hard pressure, and we're going to lift the pressure as we work into the lighter areas. And use some of the burnt sienna. And do the same, just working from the darker areas into the lighter areas and lifting the pressure off the pencil as we work towards those lighter areas. I'm going to take some of the dark sepia and just continue to add some shadows and some shading. Continue to darken a little bit through here. So we're going to work on the clumps now as well. So a little bit of a darker tone towards the base of the clump. Switching out pencils as you get darker, just working towards the base with the heavier pressure and some more concentrated fur strokes. And then as you're working out to the lighter part of the clump, you just want to lift the pressure and space out those fur lines a little bit more. I'm also going to use some of the Caput Mortuum violet, just add some shading. I'm also going to use some of the walnut brown. I'm just going to give that a quick sharpen. So adding in some darker strokes, some flower lines, so just sort of working in slightly different directions so we kind of get that nice wild look and that sort of really fluffy texture of the mane. So you should end up with a fairly lighter patch towards the tip of your particular fur clump. So we're just going to work on the next clump, and we're just going to go in with the burnt ochre, and again just work harder pressure into the bottom of the clump, and then as you come up towards the tip, just going to lift the pressure so we get a lighter tone and so it's nicely blended out. I'm going to work in some of the burnt sienna, exactly the same again. Some Purple Morton Violet. And then a little bit of the walnut brown, just coming all the way through the clump there. And then just moving on to the next one, exactly the same thing again. Lifting the pressure as you work into the tip and you've got that lighter tone. Gradually getting darker. And then once more. So just continuing this process all over until you've added in all of the clumps. Okay, and the final one. So to blend in the tops of the fur, we're just going to take the raw umber and again just shade some of this down so we've got a nice base. We're just going to take the tips of these clumps, blend it out a little bit. Let's work some of this into this darker area here. And all of this sort of darker fur does sort of come over and round a little bit more. So we're going to take the Caput Mortuum Violet and we're going to work backwards into the mane a little bit more. I'm just going to add some darker fur lines coming all the way down, sort of around the top of this mane. I know the top of the reference base is sort of cut off a little bit, so we're just kind of going to improvise the edges. Make them a little bit more wild. It's coming in with the dark chrome yellow and adding some really sort of lighter tones through here where the light would be catching. Just working through some really subtle lines of the Caput Mortuum Violet before going in with some of the walnut brown. So adding in all of these darker lines, a lot more shading on this darker element here. Just taking some more of the dark sepia. Shading a bit more of that down. I'm going to take some of the terracotta and start to bring in some more sort of orange fur as we move around to the right hand side of the head. Going to mix that with some more yellow here and there just for a little bit more sort of lighting effect, like so. So I'm quite happy with how that's looking. We can add in some nougat for a little bit more of a subtle brown hint. Bring some of that coming off the edges as well. Going to use some of the dark sepia just to add in some little fur lines, just give it this fluffy edge once more. Just adding a tiny little bit more shading as well. I'll use some more Morton Violet and just blend out this shadow. So as you darken other areas, you may notice that you just need to blend out a few of the lighter areas a little bit more. So just use your mid-tone colours and some of your darker colours and blend everything out. Like so. So now that we've got that bit down, we can just take our scalpel and we can pull out a few highlights here and there. So some of these lighter strokes just sitting over the top. Let's give it a little bit of texture. A little bit of highlighting here and there as well. So once we've pulled out a few of those highlights, we can then go back in and just glaze a little bit of colour over if we just need to alter the tone a little bit. Like so. Okay, so we've added a little bit of texture through there, which is perfect. So now we can move on to our next section. So the next part that we're going to move on to is just coming around to the right hand side here. We're going to add in all of the rest of these sort of wild looking clumps, and then that's pretty much the end of the sort of harder areas of the mane. Then we can move on to all of the sort of more sort of softer looking fur, a little bit more sort of a blurry effect we're going to add around the rest of him here. So what we're going to do is, the sketch is already light here, but if yours needs lightening, obviously go ahead and use an eraser just to get rid of the graphite. But we're just going to go in with a base layer of some cream. I'm using my Pablo cream. You can use ivory or whatever you wish. I have actually found my polychromos ivory now, but just for continuity and for the effect of the bottom layer, I'm just going to continue using my Pablo pencil here. So we're coming right into the face and just adding down the fur direction, and then just coming in, looking at the individual clumps here. And just shading in the direction that they're going. So just adding in a small section here. So just that small section there, and then we're just going to do exactly the same. We're just going to work in to some of the clumps. I'm just going to highlight the main one, which is back here. So I'm just going to go in and shade it in the direction that the fur is going in this particular clump. And then we're just going to outline it with the walnut brown. And I'm just going to do that for any obvious sections as well. I'm just going to go around with the walnut brown, just shade lightly around the edges. Move on to another obvious chunk. Again, go in and just shade where we have the dark shadows. Move on to the next chunk just here. Going in with the dark, the walnut brown, sorry. coming into this bit around the face and adding in one of these larger clumps around here, which are just coming sort of down and up. And again, just coming in and shading around the edges so that we can define all of these areas. You've got some little tufts just on the edge of the face here, which sort of come down into the face there. And then we've just got some other areas here. So we've got a largish clump here, which isn't too much of a clump, it's more sort of just wispy fur, especially towards the edges. But it does come into this sort of little hook of a fur, little clump here. I'm just going to come into the edges and do some shading with that walnut brown. And then the final clump that we have is this one just down here, so we're just going to add this one in as well. Okay, so the rest of the area we can just start to shade directly with the raw umber. Okay. So now what we're going to do is just come into these clumps and we're just going to shade and define them. So we're just going to start on this one here. So we're going to use our burnt ochre. We're going to come into the bottom of the clump of fur and just use a harder pressure. And then as we work up, we can get a little bit lighter. Also just going to use some of the dark chrome yellow just to add a really light golden sort of reflective sun yellow down. So I'm just going to shade this pretty much all over this area. And we're just going to work the burnt ochre into the bottom. This is going to act as like a blender. Then going in with the burnt sienna. So harder pressure down at the base of the clump where you've got the darkest point. So just adding in some of the darker areas. Spreading up through to the tip of the fur with the burnt sienna. We've got all of the lighter strokes, coming in with some Caput Mortuum Violet. So still getting darker. And then finally coming in with some walnut brown and getting in the really dark areas. So coming along to the next clump and doing exactly the same thing. So using the burnt ochre at the base. Coming in with some burnt sienna. Some Caput Mortem Violet. And then some walnut brown. Next clump, we're going to do the same thing again. So if your clump is slightly darker all over, just add a little bit more burnt ochre to begin with. Just remember to leave the very tips the lightest. And come in with some burnt sienna. Add in some first strokes and get darker with a heavier pressure at the base. Remember to follow the clump direction as well. Caput Mortem Violet. And then finally some walnut brown. Moving on to the next one. Exactly the same again. Using some of that burnt sienna. Some Caput Mortem Violet. And then finally a few walnut brown strands. And then we come on to the last little bit. So again, exactly the same. Switching to the burnt sienna. some Caput Mortuum Violet. And then some Walnut Brown. So we just come onto the last little clump here. Some Caput Mortuum Violet. And then finally a little bit of the Walnut Brown. Okay, so now we just need to bring everything together. So we're going to use some of the raw umber. We're also going to be using the dark chrome yellow and the dark Naples ochre. So I'm going to start off with the dark Naples ochre. I'm just going to add a light glaze of this pretty much all over. We need to also just blend in the sides of the face here as well. Just coming off the edges with some really light strands. And just shading quite liberally all over. We're also going to take the dark chrome yellow, start to add some shading of this down. This is also just going to help to blend all of those darker colours together, create a little bit of a softer appearance in these darker areas. And then what we're going to do is take the nougat and we're going to blend in the edges of the face here. So we're going to use our tip of the pencil and we're going to come down onto the face, just bring some fur lines, flowing in the direction of this bit here, so coming down and onto the face. I'm just going to darken up around the edge as well, just by doing a little bit of shading. I'm going to use the walnut brown. Just a little bit of shading on the side of the face. And just using a hard pressure and just bringing down some fur lines, just to break up this overhanging section. And just darkening up on the edges of the face here a little bit more. And what we're going to do is just take some of the walnut brown and we're just going to add some fur line just coming in some different directions. Just to give this a little bit more of like a bit more of a wild, fluffy, straggly look. Also going to use some of the light cadmium red just to add a little bit of a red, really sort of luminescent sort of feel into these darker areas. So just lightly glazing some of this down. And we're also just going to take a little bit of the dark indigo, just bring it into some of the real dark shadows here and just blend a little bit of the fur lines through so we get some really nice dark areas. So we get some really nice shadows going on. I'm going to use some terracotta just to blend in a few of the lighter areas and the clumps a little bit more. Perhaps even just use a little bit of the burnt sienna as well. So just finally, just to bring in this darker area, we're just going to bring in some Caput Mortuum Violet around. Blend this sort of darker section through a little bit more. Adds a little bit of contrast through the fur as well. I'm going to pair that with some nougat. I'm also going to use some of the walnut brown. Just continuing some of the darker strokes through here. You just got like a peep of this darker tone showing through the top. I'm also just going to add a little bit of the Caput Mortuum Violet to the side of the face. a little bit of shadow. I'm also going to use some of the red violet at this stage as well. I'm just going to spread some red violet strands through the mane so you've got that sort of light catching on some of the darker fur. Just bring it into some of the shadows as well down here. Like so. And then we are pretty much ready to move on to the next section, so we're just going to continue coming down around the face, just complete this bit of the face here. So add in this next section. It's not as difficult, it's basically just going to be a lot of shading, kind of like what we did here, so some really sort of soft, subtle shading. Thanks so much for watching the second part of this lion tutorial series. I really hope that your lions are really coming together now, and this tutorial can't just be applied to just this lion. You can actually apply the techniques and everything I kind of talk about and teach you guys within this tutorial and apply it to absolutely anything. So you can take the layering techniques and tips and you can apply it to a dog, you can apply it to plants, you can apply it to absolutely everything. So I really hope that this has helped you not only with your lion but with other coloured pencil projects that you may have lined up as well. If you have followed along with this tutorial, make sure that you tag me over on Instagram and make sure that you join up to my Facebook group as well. The link to that is in the description below for you. There's a whole bunch of people there and everybody posts their art and everybody is really super nice, and I really do encourage you guys to go and join that group. But that's it for this video. I really hope that you liked it. If you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you want more real-time content and other arty coloured pencil related videos, then make sure you hit that subscribe button if you are new here, as I post new videos every single Friday for you guys, and I have other videos sprinkled throughout the week as well now. I will catch you guys in my next video. Bye!